everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe and Kyle here for another Friday episode. Today we have a lot to talk about. And before we dig in, let's chat briefly about navigating psychedelics for clinicians and therapists. This round's kicking off on July 9. Really excited about the last whole bunch of courses we've taught. Like the current courses are going great. Just really excited about the energy in the class, the curiosity and the interactivity. Yeah, anything for you that's interesting, Kyle, about the last couple classes?
No, I just love the conversations that we're having within the classroom. And, as we've talked about, I think that's like my favorite part of being able to teach the classes. Having people go through the material, go through, the articles, the videos, and then coming to class to chat about it. So,
right.
Just loving all the little nuances that we get into. And I just find it really interesting that a lot of the courses we end up talking about spiritual emergence. Seems like a really big topic.
Yeah, it is such an interesting topic, and there's endless stuff to discuss in the psychedelic field. Spiritual emergence is so complicated and so interesting too. Like, what is this topic? Like, is the word spiritual appropriate or the right word to use? But it is some sort of emergence, right? It's like an emergence of something. It's like a slightly different entity than was there before inhabiting the body. It's like, what is this new thing? But maybe that's what it is.
Yeah, maybe we need to find a new word for that. Because I remember when I was... I brought up the topic of spiritual emergence at Soteria when I was there. Some of the feedback was like, we don't want to label this stuff as spiritual, right? And I totally get that. I don't think some people going through those experiences would say that's a spiritual experience. Maybe it's like, years later they realize, wow, that had some sort of impact on the way I view life, or that felt spiritual years down the line. But while you're in the thick of it, maybe it doesn't feel very spiritual. So yeah, maybe we need to come up with a new word, a new terminology for this stuff.
Which is tough because we want to give credit to Grof as much as we can. But yeah, it's like any system that's complex enough has really interesting emergent properties. And, we are that. We are very complicated systems showing really interesting emergent properties. And yeah, when you heal, like sometimes it's not pretty. And yeah, it's a new healed being, hopefully, is what's going to emerge. It's certainly not always the case, but yeah, cool. So yeah, there's so many great conversations, so many really professional folks out there. Like I love that we get so many doctors and nurses and coaches. It's just a really neat way to be engaged with the community. I think we've seen a lot of nurse practitioners.
A lot of expertise throughout people.
Totally. Yeah, like people that are actually working with ketamine will come to like get a better handle on what's going on in psychedelia generally, or how they might level up their practice. And yeah, it's a really cool situation. I'm really grateful people are coming and learning with us. And, at first I thought the price is a little much, but then I'm like, if we compare this to all the other training out there that I've seen, this is a way better buy, dollar for dollar. And
I just stumbled across another 8-week program based out of Utah. And I think, that one's significantly more than our program. So,
right. And, it's totally fine to go to another program, folks, if you think it's a better fit for you, but come check it out at least at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. We've got a ton of testimonials on there, and we're also happy to answer any questions for you. We don't offer continuing ed credits yet, but we are working on that. No real idea when that's going to happen, but it's something we're very serious about doing.
Mm-hmm. This is a question I think we've been getting here and there, and maybe it makes sense to just maybe tease this apart right now while people are listening, like the difference between our program and some of the other programs out there, and what we're trying to offer here. So, we know that Fluence is offering psychedelics for clinicians 101 and 102, and that's a question that we get often, like what's the difference between that program and our program? I don't know specifically, like, you could go back and listen. Yeah, we haven't taken it, so it's hard to really talk about what they're offering. But you could go back to our episode with Ingmar and Elizabeth and to listen to what they're up to. But, just knowing Dr. Gorman and Dr. Nielsen, like, they're MAPS trained therapists. They're on the phase 3 studies for MDMA. And, they're really bringing a full on, it feels like a clinical lens, which is great, going over the clinical research. They're bringing their clinical experience to the table and really focusing on that. I think where we probably differentiate a little bit is providing a strong transpersonal, philosophical, and somatic foundation in all of our years with breathwork and sitting for people and facilitating holotropic breathwork, or not holotropic breathwork, I'm sorry. Trademarked. We'll get into this. Yeah. Transpersonal breathwork, facilitating and participating. And so, yeah, I think, we're really kind of digging into some of these transpersonal nuances here and there. So if you want to have those conversations of, some of the weirdness that happens in psychedelia, we're definitely open to exploring that. And then, my background with spiritual emergence and kind of, exploring this paradigm of, mental health and labels and how are we navigating this and this fine balance between like assessment of somebody going through spiritual emergence. This is appropriate. How do we navigate this? This is a very nuanced topic. So yeah, I feel like we bring this transpersonal, somatic, and philosophy lens that we've kind of learned through the breathwork training with Lenny and Elizabeth, and that might appeal to other folks. And if you're really, really focused on more kind of like clinical stuff, maybe Fluence is it? I don't know though. Like I said, I haven't been through a program. Just doing some assuming here from
right.
folks.
And what is clinical, right? It's like you're doing it in a clinical setting. It doesn't necessarily mean that weird stuff isn't going to pop up that maybe you're not prepped for. So we like to talk about that stuff quite a bit. And how do you work with that? Like, are clinical labels actual things? Or are they abstractions? And we get into that and how do we look at that? And is everything kind of more of a spectrum or a plenum? Then, I don't know, modern science might want you to think. It's not that modern science is wrong. These are all useful. It's just perhaps not complete. And, I think they all recognize that as well. It's just everything's kind of provisional. So yeah, we try to like work that line. We talk about harm reduction a lot. We talk about all sorts of different drugs. We're not focused on just MDMA or just ketamine. We try to talk about everything that's available, including ayahuasca. We've got master classes from folks all over the world in these different areas of expertise. And yeah, I think that's one of the bigger values too. We've got all these master classes and we can come together in our class time and dissect this stuff at length. A really common question is if you miss a class, can you make it up? And yes, we've got recordings of all the classes. So if you miss the class, you can catch it later. It's not a problem. And
you'll have lifetime access to all the material and video interviews.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we've had students from all over the world, Lebanon, Nigeria, Israel, all over Europe, like UK, Ireland, Northern Ireland, Switzerland, Netherlands, Spain, France. It's pretty awesome to see how many students we've had from all over. And Australia, a lot of Australians, which is phenomenal. It's a little early in the morning, perhaps, but they make it and they are strong contributors. So it's really great to work with them as well. And I think that we might have beat it to death, but I love the class. I love that we're doing it. It's become one of my favorite parts of the week. Every week is teaching these two classes.
I feel like our goal here is just helping to have clinicians and therapists and medical professionals to be a little bit more literate with transpersonal phenomenon and the psychedelic experience. So, and also really trying to focus on the little nuances here, the integration, the self-care aspect. And so we go all over the map. There's definitely a lot of content here. We'd love to have you join us and to dialogue with us about these topics. So if you're interested, check that out, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. When you land on there, there's 2 classes called Navigating Psychedelics Lessons on Self-Care and Integration is our foundation course, which is included in the clinician package. So if you're interested, you go to psychedeliceducationcenter.com and then click on Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists. And that's the one that you want to be landing on. And if you're not a clinician, therapist, or coach or anything like that, the Lessons on Self-Care and Integration is a great foundation to start at, and anybody can join that. And that's kind of go at your own pace.
Yeah. So next up is Grof Legacy Training. So Dr. Stanislav Grof and his wife, Brigitte, have launched a new training program that's worldwide in scope and is not just about breathwork, which I think will be of interest to a lot of folks. So there's a lot of reasons why this happened. His involvement in the Grof transpersonal training program kind of dropped off a number of years ago. I think I was at one of the last 7 days that he ran, co-ran, or was co-star of. And is kind of a bummer to see him kind of fade into the background and not be utilized. So at groflegacytraining.com, there's a hyphen between each word, grof-legacy-training.com. You can learn all about it. There's going to be worldwide trainings. There's going to be stuff available in almost every country. It's a lot of, transpersonal theory, a lot of how do we bring Grof's message and teachings into the current psychedelic world and various breathwork traditions, because there's been a lot of fracturing. Like even in the 70s, I think there was fracturing with Jacqueline Small and the Psychia Institute. And even though the techniques are almost identical, they have to have different names just for trademark reasons. And, I get it, but it's certainly kind of a bummer. We're not going to start calling or maybe they will. There'll be like funny trade names for MDMA. Like we'll call it like Polysmile. And then you have to go to a Polysmile clinic and then you go through their proprietary techniques. And, I wouldn't be surprised because like we did that with ketamine, right? Spravato. And you have to go to like a really specific place to go get it. Drugs get trade names. So techniques get trade names too. And even if they look really similar, to speak to our tradition, like holotropic breathwork at Dream Shadow, they're still doing holotropic breathwork retreats and workshops, or they were before COVID, but they're calling it Dream Shadow Transpersonal Breathwork now, and Dream Shadow Transpersonal Breathwork Training, or Dream Shadow Transpersonal Training, I think. So they weren't allowed to teach inside the GTT model, so they had to start their own thing. So even with, decades of experience, they weren't allowed to teach breathwork inside that organization that Stan sold to Tav and Carrie Sparks. So, what do you do? And I think this happened all over the place. There's a lot of folks that kind of split because they weren't included in the main program. And, as a result, it went really horizontal. Like there wasn't, much growth inside the organization. Like you couldn't really climb the ladder through any kind of good works or effort. So people just started their own thing all over the place. And didn't you talk to somebody once, Kyle, that said that this is actually pretty common in kind of alternative practices?
I was going to say, like, as you're talking about this, I was reflecting on when I went to my first residency, or maybe when I was checking out my somatic program, the clinical mental health and somatic program at Prescott. The advisor over there was talking about these fractures that happen in this community. And, she was just making a comment about the somatic community being so all over the place. So, I forget the history and lineage here, and so I'm sorry if I screw it up. Please do your research to verify this. But some of these somatic things really started with like one person. So like it might have started with sensory motor and then branched off to Hakomi and then Peter Levine's work with somatic experiencing. And so you had all these people working together on these theories and these practices, and then people split off and started doing their own thing. So in the somatic world, there's all sorts of different techniques that really stem from like, the root work of a few people. And so I think this is pretty common when you start to get into, say, trademarks and like, prescriptive protocols and people are trying to create programming. And I mean, I guess it makes sense to create programming for whatever you're trying to do, right? To try to contain it a little bit, to keep the integrity, you try to keep that integrity and the tradition alive within that program. But I mean, people start to want to improvise, right? And people want to start to maybe change things, or they're already bringing a little bit of like their background to whatever they're getting trained in. And maybe they want to add a little bit of seasoning to it and switch up a technique. Maybe they notice something that doesn't work for them. And so instead of staying within those programs, they might split off and do something kind of similar, but a little bit different, and they call it something completely new. And I think this is pretty common. I mean, innovation happens this way, right? Like sometimes people stay in those traditions and are really molded to that and want to stay there and feel really called to stay there. And then other times people feel like, hey, maybe something isn't working here. Maybe I want to improvise and do something different. And they branch off and start something new. And so I actually think that's healthy. And you know what? The Gibsons have always like encouraged us to, you're going to probably do something a little bit different, right? At times, and really encourage us to follow what we're doing. And of course, like if we are offering, in their tradition and their format, we're going to call that dream shadow transpersonal breathwork. But like I've definitely taken the stuff that I've done there and changed it a little bit. I don't call it dream shadow. Maybe I'll just call it transpersonal breathwork or this or that, where I'm just starting off and maybe I don't have a bunch of people to work with. So I'm doing shorter sessions that feel safer for me to run than trying to do a whole weekend by myself and feeling like I'm scattered. So yeah, I don't know. I think that improvising could be important for the evolution of things, right? I don't know. You got any thoughts on that?
We need small experiments to happen everywhere. Small, cheap experiments. And you've got a really interesting background in that you've got some kind of traditional shamanic trainings and knowledge that you can share inside the breathwork context too. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, dream shadow stuff for it to be valuable. And I don't know how to totally relate to all this rebirthing style breathwork and what they call transformative breathwork practices. Like the language just doesn't super jive for me sometimes. And some of it seems like, oh, we know something that nobody else knows. And it's like, well, I don't know. Like maybe, but I don't necessarily need to believe that. And I'm not necessarily going to shit on people for having those beliefs either. Though sometimes they'll roll my eyes when they say certain things. I'm not always doing that. I'm like, okay, how does this possibly relate to how I see stuff? Or like, could their type of breath work be better than ours? I'm like, I don't know about better. I just think there's different types of breath work that do different things.
And I think like it's going to draw different people. Like when I think of like, say like, you brought up the shamanic piece, Linda Starwolf, I don't know if she went through any of the holotropic training or maybe she just did a few workshops with them, but she branched off to do what's called shamanic breath work. And, she's probably attracting people that want to incorporate animal spirits or more ceremony into it. And that's going to resonate for some people. It's not going to resonate for others, right? And Jackie Smalls was a holotropic breathwork facilitator. And I forget what she branched off to do. Maybe it was something called transformational breathwork.
Psychia.
Oh, okay.
Was the name of her institute. I don't know what she calls her stuff, though. But it was almost identical, according to some people I talked to, like Byron Metcalf. And I used to facilitate with somebody that went through her program, Faith. Lenny's cousin went through her program, and the method was nearly identical between the two. Like she might have had a slightly different take, but not that big. And we worked great together, even though we came from slightly different backgrounds. It was pretty cool.
Yeah. And I think something about like the dream shadow lineage, it's like the technique is obviously pretty identical, probably pretty on par with how holotropic breathwork operates.
Yeah,
but
nearly the same.
Yeah, but I think like what's different there is like that seasoning, right? Is Lenny is bringing his like metaphysics, his Whiteheadian philosophy into this mix, and a lot of his training is also incorporating a lot of philosophy, which you might not be getting in that GTT lineage, and I think that's unique, and that's what Lenny and Elizabeth are bringing to their work. And it doesn't always fit with everybody. Like I remember some of the philosophy and metaphysics goes over my head or has gone over other people's head, but over the years I've been really appreciating it, and actually my interest is starting to turn more into that. Like Lenny's has given Joe and I a bunch of reading, and this past week I've been digging into some of those Christian theologians, and I'm like, oh man, this stuff's really fascinating.
Who knew I would like it? It's like, St. Augustine of Hippo, who knew I liked you? Fascinating. Yeah. And he didn't really seem to turn into a creep until his older days, which is pretty good. Yeah, but no, it's really fascinating, like how all of these things will develop. And I think we touched on it in the Eric Davis interview on Monday, or I did. Like these splinters, these groups, cults, whatever, are kind of important to the evolution of humanity. Like we need to see different stuff develop over time. And, this is just kind of part of it. Like how humans, and didn't we see it when kind of the Native Americans kind of made it to North America? They kind of like, okay, like we got enough people here, go split off and do your thing. And, I think a lot of human history was probably that way too. Got enough people in the village, go do your thing over there. One valley over and you're fine. It's like, polyculture, I guess. The more individual groups there are, the more resilient it can be at times. Like, assuming we don't get in trouble with the law, which has happened in breathwork. But I don't want to get into that now. But yeah, if we look at the psychedelic world, like we're doing pretty good overall. But if we had a couple high profile situations, perhaps we would get some pushback from the DEA and the executive branch, just for, getting more votes. Oh, look, this poor people got hurt by MDMA. Therefore, nope, FDA, you're out. Which thankfully it seems like the FDA is kind of resistant, but to political pressure. But there's some risks there. Anyway, back to this Grof Legacy Training here. Kind of want to just look through the website briefly. So it's got some really great history there. You got the history of breathwork, history of Grof training. It talks about how Grof kind of sold the training group to Tav and Carrie Sparks, who are kind of the stewards now. Talks a little bit about how well they did and perhaps some limitations that were imposed on Stan, and just some issues there. And what Stan wants to do with his last years. He's pretty old.
Yeah.
Kind of public knowledge. He had a stroke a year or two ago. And so he's certainly just wants to really pass on as much as he can and get everybody a little more literate in this stuff. There's not too many people with his level of experience, with his level of, compassion and interest in helping folks. And especially now with how popular psychedelics are becoming.
Mm-hmm.
I just started hearing about this Tony Robbins stuff and I'm like, oh, good Lord. Like this is really going to make it perhaps too popular. Like I wouldn't be surprised if there was some Tony Robbins retreat center somewhere in the next year. I don't know that I could advise people to go there, but think about it. So I think what happened is Stan wrote these books, The Way of the Psychonaut, Volume 1 and 2. And then there was the film that's coming out any day now. I think 1 or 2 days it'll be out and you can rent it online, The Way of the Psychonaut. And I think
really awesome.
Yeah. I definitely recommend watching it. It's the best thing I've watched on Stan ever. So I was consistently disappointed with stuff in the past. And this is actually really great. And I think as a result of the books and the films, Stan wanted to start, issuing, more education, not just around breathwork. Like how can Stan teach people to prep for ayahuasca or LSD or whatever? And I think that's perhaps what's going on here. And I'm really excited about it. So there's going to be schools or groups in every country, I think, taking it on. Like I see on the website, Argentina, Austria, Belgium, Brazil, Chile, China even. And from what I've heard, China is some folks in China are really enamored of Stan's work. Looks like 2 groups in Czech Republic, Denmark, Ecuador, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, Peru. Yeah, like there's so many countries. South Korea, 2 in Switzerland, Uruguay. Yeah, it's just really, really amazing to see that there's a lot of stuff blowing up here. So stay tuned on that. I don't know that I have anything more to really add here. Do you, Kyle?
No, I'm just excited to see this launch. I know that I think it was back in 2014, a group of people got together after a conference based on Grof's legacy work at it was hosted by the California Institute of Integral Studies, and
the Festschrift.
Yeah. I knew there was a German term for that. I forgot what it was. But a group of people got together and tried to form the Grof Foundation there. And I think this is what they were trying to do, is form some sort of umbrella branch. So people like, say Len and Elizabeth could pass on, some of their breathwork knowledge under that, trademark as well. And so, I'm just glad that, all this hasn't gone completely under, and, Stan and his wife are trying to really pass this on. And I mean, his work is really important. Obviously, if you've been following our show, I mean, very influential in the reason why we started this whole thing. So, his work is at the root of our work in a sense. So I'm just excited that they're trying to do everything that they can to pass his work on. And, it reminds me when I was at Burlington College, and I think we're trying to get an interview via email through Stan. And one of the questions I added in there had to do with his legacy. Because I remember when I put together his course, the course called Stanislav Grof's Psychology of Extraordinary Experiences at Burlington College, that was my capstone. I remember Lenny and Elizabeth were able to get Stan to Skype in for Q&A for our course. And it was like how we were closing the course out, which was really cool. I remember he started, I think he was turning 80, I forget how old he was at the time, 85 maybe, 84. But he was just saying like, I'm getting at the point where I'm starting to think about my legacy and how I'm going to pass this down and how I'm going to be remembered. And, I think he was just excited to know that, there was a college course teaching his work there. And so, it's just cool to see that he's still trying to figure out, how am I passing down my legacy? Well, not mine, but I'm speaking from Stan with this group.
Though we have been pressed on that, like to think about our legacy. Like, okay, what are you doing during your lifetime, but what is it going to look like after your lifetime is done? Food for thought. Yep. All right, next topic. Peyote. Hot button issue lately in the psychedelic world. I've seen a lot of shots fired all over the place around peyote between a lot of different people and groups that are somewhat influential. To me, the crux of the issue is that Native American church folks don't have as much access as they need to appropriately grown peyote. And a lot of people are making peyote really popular for, Westerners, gringos, like non-Native Americans to consume. And I don't know that that's the right move. I think I even saw that Shamans of the Global Village did a thing on peyote, like popularizing peyote, and that just kind of feeds the hunger. We saw this in the 5-MeO world. We're still seeing it with Tony Robbins and whatnot, and Mike Tyson. So, it's troubling to me. Like, okay, so yeah, sure, you can kind of do fine with 1980, 1990s levels of consumption with gringos, maybe. But once you start getting it on the popular media a lot, consumption just could exponentially rise. And therefore, Native American church members might have substantially less access to their sacrament. So to me, that's the crux of it. Like, why are we doing that? And, what can we do about it? Like, we kind of know that, mass grown meat is not great for the environment. Like, confined animal feedlot operations are brutal and they're environmental catastrophe and they're not humane. But we still do it because, we've got all these cooking shows and we've got the culture. We've got cultural momentum on this, and, we can do better than that, but we haven't. And are we going to do better than we're doing with peyote? I don't really think so. So to me, like, we can tell people not to do it and it's racist to eat peyote, but perhaps what needs to happen, and this might not be legal, but perhaps in countries where peyote isn't scheduled, people need to be growing or could be growing a lot of this stuff in greenhouses. I know it takes a long time to grow, but there's hacks that you could do just to feed that Western appetite. And this is kind of a permaculture method. It's like, okay, you've got your garden, but what do you feed? What do you plant outside your garden so the deer just eat that stuff and don't eat your tomatoes or whatever, or the rabbits eat certain plants outside your garden. So you're actually feeding elements of the system that you can't control through low effort means. So you're feeding back into the environment, but you still get to keep what you want to keep.
Right.
And there's something there about that. Like, okay, so Ukraine, and I think there's a country in Southeast Asia where you can grow this stuff. And I think it's not scheduled in Canada. So between those three countries, I think somebody who's entrepreneurial enough could figure that out. There's obviously very strong legal risks. So be very careful, people. But, somebody could do that. Like, I was thinking about it the other day, but I'm like, it's too many legal risks. I can't really do it. And I don't actually know if I think it's super ethical yet, but something for people to consider. I don't know. Any thoughts or comments so far, Kyle?
Something that comes up just thinking about that of like growing in other countries, like I wonder how some people would view that as like a cultural appropriation of taking this sacrament and just trying to make a market out of it for Westerners. But like, I get it because people are trying to, have these experiences already, and it's kind of depleting the native population, and the people that have been using this, I think, should have, first rights over that. And, I know there was an article a while ago about, I don't remember in full detail, but just talking some Native Americans were stepping up and kind of criticizing decriminalized nature for including peyote into their statement. And yeah, I mean, here's a cacti that is starting to become over harvest, and the people that use it, part of their spirituality and part of their culture, they can't even get access to it at times, or it's just starting to become very limited. I don't know. As consumers, I think we should be conscious about that. And I think, maybe if there is that Western appetite that people want to do this outside of the Native American church and they haven't been, say, initiated into that group that's using it traditionally, like maybe there should be a market for greenhouse grown peyote. Or what about like San Pedro, right? That could be an alternative, even though I guess it might be a little bit different.
That's the main suggestion.
But
yeah, like that's the cactus of choice for gringos. I'm like, well, yeah, it doesn't have the same mass appeal. It's like I want Wagyu beef from Japan. It's like, well, geez. And like I'm in Phoenix right now. I feel kind of bad about coming down here, but I had to help somebody, and people aren't wearing masks. It's like at one gas station I went to, I saw one out of like 80 people inside. There was one 90-year-old man with a mask on. And then secondarily, like we know certain things are racist, right? But cops are still murdering black people, shooting them in the back. And, we know racism is bad. We know that cops shouldn't be killing people and shooting them in the back, but they still do it. So, just because we come out and say it's not okay to do this, it doesn't mean that people care or are going to change their behaviors. Mm-hmm. Like, it's great to make statements, but statements don't always work. So if we want to act and preserve peyote domestically for people, perhaps that's what needs to happen. I don't have the clear answer, but I do know that people don't really listen to ethical guidelines, even if they're stepping into these spaces. So how do we kind of create the container so they do less harm or no harm? Yeah, it's kind of like the Catholic Church having like an eBay for consecrated wafers and holy water or something, like how, I understand that it's a holy thing, but it's like, how do you get like a bunch of, urban kids to care,
right?
Enough to not buy that. If you think that's really holy, it's a weird conversation. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but digging in, I think, is really important. But yeah, how do we respect the Native American church's rights? Yeah. Which we really should do. Native Americans are really in a bad spot because of colonialism and genocide and all these bad things that happened. And, how do we deal with that? Like, it's not to make stronger laws against peyote use by white folks, I don't think, because prohibition doesn't work. But perhaps as insiders, we talk about how we should perhaps use less peyote. And if people want to address the situation head on, they look at how they can get active in it. Like there's the River Styx Foundation and a few other groups like Bronner's are helping with this peyote conservation project in Texas. We talked about it on the River Styx Foundation episode with Cody, I think his name was. And it's really, really fascinating. So you pick one, you plant two in this really great reserve. It's not an enormous reserve, but it's good enough for now. It's a good start. So people can actually, Native American church folks can actually commune with the plant before it's even harvested for use, consumption in a ceremony. And, that's pretty amazing. So maybe we need more of those too, where it's only NAC people get access to it. Like I know that I'm specifically not eating peyote because of this situation. Like I've never had it. I'm going to give it another 10 years before I even look at having it or consuming it. Yeah. And, we'll see. we'll see. I don't know. I probably beat that one to death, but I think it's really important stuff to talk about.
Yeah, I think it is too. And I think that was actually a huge track at the Chacruna Psychedelic Liberty Summit. There was a lot of discussion on peyote conservation and peyote use. Fortunately, I should go back and watch some of this stuff, but I was moderating the one day, so I didn't really get to see some of those talks. But yeah, I think it's a huge topic, and I think a sensitive topic as well. Kind of just coming back to that cultural appropriation thing. And, like me, or like you, I've been thinking like, if I were to do something like that, I think I would probably go after like San Pedro that, you could buy as a lawn ornament, right? Like it's
they got it at Home Depot.
Readily available in some sense, right? And it does have its cultural use down in South America. I don't know. This is a tricky topic, and I've talked to, I remember chatting to my one teacher about cultural appropriation, and because me and a friend kind of got called out one time at an elders gathering for just serving cacao there. And it was weird because we were invited to go there, and the person that invited us told us, oh, hey, you should bring some cacao to offer to the community. And we're like, okay, sure. And we did like a donation thing. Anybody that gave us money, we were giving back to that site. It was, we weren't making any money off of it. Maybe we made enough to pay for our supplies, but most of it just went back into the community. It was our offering. But this whole thing happened with these elders, and they ended up sitting down with us and talking about like the cultural appropriation of medicines, and overall, it went good. They just didn't know who we were, and they didn't know our intentions. They thought we were just making money. They didn't realize that we were actually just doing an exchange of offering this to give back to their community. And so I brought this like to my teacher, and I forget what he said, but he's like, this is going to happen, right? I mean, people are going to do what they do, but I think the integrity is the most important part about all of this. And, he kind of always like told me, I mean, even from like shamanic perspective, he's like, you could be white, but spirit chooses you to go do something, right? Does that mean you shouldn't do it because you're white? If spirit's calling to you, I guess that can kind of get grandiose at times, if you have an ayahuasca or you jump into some of these experiences and you have a grandiose vision, maybe you got to pull back and think about it. But it was nice to chat a lot about this cultural appropriation thing with a few elders, Native American elders. And, the one person did bring up peyote during our conversation, and I forget what he was talking about, just really coming down to respect and really respecting the tradition, respecting the plant. And it doesn't mean that, you as a Westerner can't participate, but really just understand where we're coming from and take the time to understand our tradition. And we don't want to see people abusing it and just really, reaping the benefit from it and making a bunch of money from it and really taking it away from like the traditional use. And I think that's a really great point, right? Like, how do we preserve those traditional, beliefs, systems, and, just really respect it. And I think that's where I come from. It's like, how do we just respect this stuff? And that's why I've never really tried to approach like peyote, I'm like, they have their thing, and I know the conservation thing, so I don't want to feed into that anymore.
And two last things. I don't know if I said this, but at 2017 Psychedelic Science, there was a talk that I was in. This amazing Navajo woman, maybe. I kind of forget where she was from, but she talked a lot about peyote conservation there, and they suggested the elders thought greenhouse grown peyote wasn't appropriate for ceremonial use, and it was only appropriate if it was grown in the earth, kind of in a non-cultivated fashion, and naturally. And yeah, so there's a lot of people growing greenhouse peyote, I guess, but it wasn't appropriate for them. So they've got to figure that out. Yeah. And secondly, like, we've still got billions of people out there who are starving for spirituality, and they're going to try to find it wherever they can. And maybe it's a harm reduction approach. How do we do the least harm possible, as opposed to a perfectionism, idealist approach? I don't know what the right answer is, But I know that we're not going to stop people, even if we say things or make new laws. People are still going to go for it. Drug laws and guilt never stopped anybody from doing drugs that really wanted to do them. Plant medicine. So yeah, it's a tough one. Hopefully we make progress on it eventually, but perhaps the right approach is more chemists making just straight up mescaline. Perhaps people growing a ton of this stuff in greenhouses and offering it for less money than naturally grown stuff. Like perhaps that's the way to do it. I know it could take years to address this, but let's start thinking about it.
Yeah. And I don't know, I'm just even thinking like, I've never really spoke to people in those like communities, and it just makes me even think like, yeah, maybe we should even just run a series on this and find these elders to talk about this. Cause I mean, being two white folks that, I don't know, never had any contact with, these traditions, like, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about sometimes, so yeah, maybe we just need to get those voices out there and think about like, see how they would want to approach it and what's right, what feels right. And
yeah. So if anybody knows NAC members who are not white folks that want to chat with us, we'd love to have a conversation. So hit us up, Psychedelics Today email at gmail.com. We definitely we know there's a lot of nuance here and complicated stuff to discuss, but yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, I'm sure you probably even know folks. I mean, you're probably more centrally located of that being in Colorado and like, you're more the Southwest. I'm up here in the Northeast, and that's so far away from, from me.
It's all over Colorado.
Yeah.
There's a lot that happens. There's the roadmen that it's their jam to drive down to Texas, pick it up and bring it back up wherever they want to go. Yeah. There's a limited number of folks who are licensed to do that, and they're out there. Yeah. So let's jump to this Johnny Hopkins study here titled Survey of Entity Encounter Experiences Occasioned by Inhaled N,N-dimethyltryptamine, Phenomenology, Interpretation, and Enduring Effects by Alan Davis, John Clifton, Eric Weaver, and more, published April 28, 2020. This is interesting. Got a lot of press. The background title here on the Sage Pub article, experiences of having an encounter with seemingly autonomous entities are sometimes reported after inhaling N,N-dimethyltryptamine. The study characterized the subjective phenomena, interpretation, and persisting changes that people attribute to N,N-dimethyltryptamine occasioned entity encounter experiences, and the methods. 2,561 individuals, mean age of 32 years, 77% male, completed an online survey about their single most memorable entity encounter after taking NN-DMT. Results: respondents reported the primary senses involved in the encounter were visual and extrasensory, e.g. telepathic. The most common descriptive labels for the entity were being, guide, spirit, alien, and helper. Although 41% of respondents reported fear during the encounter, the most prominent emotions both in the respondent and attributed to the entity were love, kindness, and joy. Most respondents endorsed that the entity had the attributes of being conscious, intelligent, and benevolent, existed in some real but different dimension of reality, and continued to exist after the encounter. Respondents endorsed receiving a message, 69%, or a prediction about the future, 19%, from the experience. More than half of those who identified as atheist before the experience no longer identified as atheist after. Wow. The experiences were, yeah, right. It's probably the most substantial thing. The experiences were rated as among the most meaningful, spiritual, and psychologically insightful lifetime experiences, with persisting positive changes in life satisfaction, purpose, and meaning attributed to the experience. So it seems like overall, like DMT starting to look therapeutic in a smoked form almost. The conclusion here: N,N-dimethyltryptamine occasioned entity encounter experiences have many similarities to non-drug entity encounter experiences. such as those described in religious, alien abduction, and near-death contexts. Aspects of the experience and its interpretation produced profound and enduring ontological changes in worldview. Yeah. So there's a lot there. I don't know. Any initial thoughts when you were cruising through this earlier?
There were a few, and now I'm just like looking at it again, and this is really interesting. When asked about attributes of the entity, a majority of the samples reported that the entity was conscious, so 96%, intelligent, 96%, benevolent, 78%, sacred, 70%, had agency in the world, 54%, positively judgmental, 52%, and fewer reported about petitionable, 23%, negatively judgmental, 16%, and malicious, 11%. So what's going on there with this idea that these entities are conscious, they're intelligent, and they have agency? You know, because coming back to this idea of abstraction that we've touched on, I think last week or the week before, you know, what are these things? Are they abstractions of the mind, or are they actually conscious and intelligent? And they do have some sort of agency in the world. So I don't know. That's really fascinating. That just stuck out as I'm skimming through this.
Made me think of like, so we say mental construct, and then we say psychic construct. Very different. Like, you would almost think it was the same thing, but it just has so many different connotations. Like, what, you know, if it's a psychic construct, it could be something that's somewhat actual, maybe, or perhaps it's an abstraction. And I don't know, like it's kind of cliche to say this, but our senses are quite limited. Well,
have you been listening to that Aquinas audiobook?
I haven't touched Aquinas yet. I'm still working through Augustine of Hippo.
Cool. Well, I was listening to Aquinas yesterday, this audiobook that Joe and I are chewing through for some philosophy stuff with Lenny. And they were talking about Aquinas's view on time and then on other things. And as I was listening to this, I was like, man, this is just so psychedelic. But they brought up this idea of like, you know, dimensionality, I guess, and kind of thinking back, I think Carl Sagan had this whole thing about the 2D folks, but like, so, you know, this person was just talking about 2D people. And then I guess she was really talking about this as being God. So maybe like the human is in the 2D and then God is on this other like dimension, and the flatlander that doesn't have all those dimensions is like, you know, can't see the person above you in that other dimension when, you know, that person is speaking to you and, you know, having some sort of interaction. The 2D person is just flat and can't see or interact with any of that. And so that got me thinking a little bit about like, you know, these encounters with entities and gods. And I know that kind of sounds, I guess, starting to get a little new agey with the like the dimensions, but it really kind of started putting things, I guess, in perspective when I was listening to this, in a sense of like, yeah, what is it if there are these extra dimensions there, and we're starting to maybe tap into a new way of being, like, you know, a new sense perception, and kind of going out of that 2D flatlander reality into something else and being able to communicate with this other thing that hangs out in another dimension. So I don't know, when I was listening to that yesterday, I was like having all these like thoughts about how this metaphysics of what this woman was describing of Aquinas's metaphysics was also very psychedelic, and thinking about like entity encounters and time and eternity and timelessness. So
there was a book in 1884 titled Flatland by Edwin Abbott, and it's been used a lot in conversations like this to talk about how a higher dimensional entity might appear to us to interact in the world. And, you know, in Terence McKenna's phrasing, like, it's stranger than we can suppose in a lot of ways. Like, we just can't, like, a lot of stuff that's possible doesn't seem possible to us. So, and I've thought a lot about this because I've been exposed to the occult world a lot, and like had to think about entities and ultimate realities and stuff like that quite a bit. Sometimes interact with them, and it's like, this is not the way I thought these entities would interact with me or the world. It's like, apparently they can operate outside of time, which is a pretty creepy concept. I mean, outside of space, like when DMT space, it's like appears to you to be their native habitat.
Yeah.
But it's like, is your interaction with them like, oh, look, the mouse learned how to talk. Very cool. let's play with it. And then send it back. Is that what's going on? Perhaps, I don't know. Or like you've had more interactions with the entities than I have. Like, did you get a sense that they were really playful and like conscious? Yeah. What other kind of attributes, like relative to what you saw on the list here in the study?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely felt like they had some sort of intelligence. They were kind. I mean, very playful and trickery. I wouldn't say that they were necessarily evil. I mean, it was kind of like that trickster archetype of like, hey, I want to show you this. And hey, look at this. And that's really painful. But hey, learn how to laugh about it. And I mean, who knows? Like maybe since I had that first experience when I was like 19, I mean, I had no concept of that. Like I didn't know about Terence McKenna. I didn't know about Rick Strassman's work. That was so novel and so new. And I was just blown away how I could ingest a substance like mushrooms and be able to have this entity encounter that, I could draw and I can describe. I mean, that image is burned in my memory at this point. And I was really freaked out about like the intelligence behind these things. And it really blew me away in a lot of different ways. And I came back thinking like, that was realer than anything I've ever experienced. And these things gave me information. And, again, I've sat with this experience. I've viewed it as maybe recontextualizing the near-death experience. Maybe that was the way my mind is constructing this metaphor and this image to give me some sense of peace around where did these messages come from. But again, I didn't go into this experience wanting to explore any of that stuff. It just naturally unfolded. And yeah, those things, I've had interactions with them, a few other times in my early 20s when I would go into those spaces. And it felt like they were always there. And maybe I just had to, I could communicate with them. So I don't know. It's very interesting. And interesting that, that's on psilocybin, not necessarily with DMT.
Yeah, it doesn't always need to be DMT, right? It's kind of, this stuff is always there. You just, how do you get it? How do you access it in so many different ways? Yeah. You could have a near-death experience or have holotropic breathwork or acid or whatever. Entities can happen. It just seems like, for whatever reason, DMT seems to occasion the most entities most regularly, which is super interesting. In the New Atlas article that kind of talked about this study, Alan Davis was interviewed, and I just want to read this quote, and then we can kind of chat about something Grof said a while ago. What a short-acting tryptamine does, like DMT, is it makes it conceivable that you could have multiple sessions happen in a day with multiple patients. So you could have someone come in, have a psychedelic experience in an hour, and then process it with their therapist and go on and have their day, hypothesizes Davis. That's from the New Atlas article titled DMT Survey. Well, I don't really know what it's called. Let me just get the title before we move on. Largest ever DMT survey travels to the fringes of psychedelic science. So like what that made me think of was at Psychedelic Science 2017, when Grof got on stage saying 5-MeO DMT is the future of psychiatry. And, we were like, okay, what the fuck does he mean? Like, that's pretty crazy. Is it, this, how do we imagine that clinic looking? And is it reasonable? Perhaps I think it is, but the idea was, people could come in, you'd have a facilitated session after being like scoped for being, safe for it. You'd have some prep integration done before showing up. You'd have the experience, and then you could, after you came down, you could chill out for a little while in kind of a safe container, maybe with some headphones on, chilling, listening to some safe music. And then you have a session with your therapist once you're kind of fully on the ground. And then, conceivably 12 hours later, you could drive home or something, or like get a taxi home like they do in the ketamine sessions, hopefully. So Yeah. And could you do the same thing with NN-DMT? Like, because there's no reactivation, like in 5-MeO-DMT, perhaps it's safer to start with this type of DMT. I don't know. Any kind of thoughts come up when you hear that quote from Alan Davis there?
I mean, when you're thinking about resources on that clinical side, it does seem really effective, right? You're kind of catapulting somebody out. You're back within 15, 20 minutes. You can have multiple sessions. You're eliciting a very powerful, mystical experience for folks without the whole, 4, 6, 8 hours of being with somebody, just doing one client at a time. With that said, I always, though, come back to the ritual behind it. Maybe they build that in, but just thinking about like, these are very powerful states, and how are we preparing for people for these experiences, and what would a clinic just be like, just cranking out DMT experiences of people? It's like, hey, just come in. We're able to do this within an hour, right? Or half an hour, right? Because DMT used to be called the businessman's trip, because you could go on your lunch break, have a DMT trip, and go back to the office. I don't know who would do that, but that sounds pretty intense.
I know plenty of people that did it.
Really? Wow. All right. Well,
yeah. Some of whom no longer are employed.
But I mean, there is something I think really interesting about having a short-acting, powerful psychedelic for clinical use, right? I mean, there was some stuff in here that was saying about the significance of these experiences. Where was it? It was around like 50 to 60% of people saying how significant that DMT experience was. And, if you could deliver that to folks. Yeah, so they said over one half, 54 to 65% of the sample reported the entity encounter was one of the most top 5 or single most personally meaningful, spiritually significant, and psychologically insightful experiences of their lives.
Yeah.
That's huge. And, they said approximately 1/3, 32% reported the encounter was one of the top 5 or single most psychologically challenging experiences of their lives. So, if you could facilitate a profound experience like that, if somebody is struggling existentially, struggling with different parts of their lives, and they don't have to take off an entire day, right? I mean, we've talked about this plenty with MDMA therapy, psilocybin therapy, of the privilege and access there of kind of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Like, you need to dedicate a whole day or maybe a whole weekend to this stuff, and how expensive is it going to be versus like having a very short session, and within an hour you could have that session and then do processing with a therapist right afterwards. So I could definitely see some significance there. How, like, ethically, how people are operating, that's a whole other can of worms, I think.
Right. Right. Because once it's prescribable, if it becomes prescribable ever, like there's going to be some people cutting corners. And
totally,
even if the standard of care is X, doesn't mean they're going to do it. So yeah, a lot of tricky stuff to navigate. Just because stuff is illegal, it doesn't mean facilitators are doing a great job. In fact, quite the contrary. There's a lot of people doing really nasty stuff out there, and it's largely because of prohibition and the drug war. Mm-hmm. So, food for thought. If things are above board, at least you can call them out on Yelp somewhat permanently, which you can't really do that nowadays, or you'll get in big trouble.
Mm-hmm. I also, too, I wonder too, like in a clinical setting about smoking.
Sure.
Yeah. I guess you could do
There's FDA approved vape devices, apparently. Like, I think they use, I won't say where because I was told not to, but there are like FDA approved crack pipes essentially. So we'd have to come up with other situations which I think could get FDA approval.
Yeah.
It's just, inhaled devices. I think we could come up with something that would be approvable.
Yeah.
Just a matter of time.
Yep.
And with pharmaceutical grade DMT, as opposed to, plant-based extractions, like I think you could consume less total molecule, less total compounds, and have quite the extraordinary experience. So perhaps safer than the underground stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, food for thought. I think I'm good to wrap here. We're at about an hour, 3 minutes.
Yeah.
maybe, yeah, just a quick reminder, psychedelicEducationCenter.com. I got some free classes, some paid classes. On July 9th, we've got Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists with some limited seats. So we've got 40 total spots available. We sold a whole bunch. So I actually haven't done the math yet to see how many we have left, but they are going. And if you want to secure your spot, go over, check it out, see if it's for you, and sign up if it is for you. And happy to answer questions at Psychedelics Today email at gmail.com. Anything you want to add?
Something that popped in, a question that we get asked often besides the CE credit question, is there a certificate? So you will get a certificate upon the completion of the video lectures and everything via our platform Teachable. So if that's enticing to you, that's part of the package as well.
Yeah. Some people like evidence that they completed a training program, and we do want to help you with that because this is a big deal. Like, this is coming. Psychedelics are going to be clinical pretty soon. Might take a year or two more, but well, we've already got clinical psychedelics. So
yeah,
what are we talking about? It's already here.
It's here.
Future is here. It's just not equally distributed yet.
Yep.
Cool. Well, that's it for this Friday's episode. Thanks, Kyle.
Yeah, thanks, Joe, and hope everybody stays safe and everybody enjoy the weekend if you're listening to this on a Friday.
All right. See you next time, everybody.